My grandmother left me a ripped coat as my cousins took $9 million. Revenge exposed what she hid from me. My grandmother's will changed my life in a way I never expected, while my cousins divided a $9 million estate in Boston. I was handed nothing but a ripped, outdated coat. They laughed at me in that lawyer's office. Michael leaned back in his chair and smirked, asking if I planned to pawn it for lunch money. Sarah whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear, saying it was fitting for someone who always lived like a stray. I held the coat in my hands, trying to hide the humiliation burning inside me. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting to see if I would break. My Uncle Richard gave me that cold little smile of his, the kind that always carried the message that I didn't belong. For a second, I considered throwing the coat in the trash on my way out of the building. But something stopped me. Something about the way my grandmother's hands had folded the fabric, as though it wasn't just a coat, but a message she wanted only me to find. When I got home and ran my fingers along the lining, I felt it, a hard ridge, out of place, hidden beneath the stitches. I grabbed a pair of scissors and sliced it open. A small sealed envelope slipped onto the floor. My chest tightened. I opened it, and when I read the words inside, my hands started to shake so badly I nearly dropped the letter. When I walked out of that Cambridge office clutching the worn coat, it felt as though every ounce of dignity had been stripped from me. The polished marble floors, the golden light streaming from chandeliers, and the smell of expensive cologne lingering in the air. All of it belonged to the world of my cousins. I was just a shadow at the edge of it, the forgotten grandson who had no claim to the Carter fortune. I am Daniel Carter, 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, money has never been my ally. I work at a small independent bookstore in Hartford, surrounded by shelves of dusty novels and poetry that sell slower than the rent climbs. I make enough to keep my one-bedroom apartment, barely enough to cover groceries, and never enough to silence the question that follows me everywhere. What would my life have been if my grandmother's love had been matched with her wealth? Margaret Carter, my grandmother, was the anchor of my childhood. She was not the kind of woman who measured people by their bank accounts. She measured them by honesty, kindness, and how they treated others when no one was watching. After my mother Helen passed away when I was just 10 years old, it was Margaret Carter who kept me afloat. She brought me into her kitchen, taught me to stir soup while telling stories about her own childhood during the Great Depression, and reminded me that strength was not about loudness, but about quiet persistence. My Uncle Richard never saw me that way. He saw me as a burden. He married into the family after my mother's death, and from the moment he arrived, he treated me as though I had trespassed into a life that did not belong to me. Richard was sharp in his business dealings, ruthless in his judgments, and determined to mold his children into the same. His son Michael grew into arrogance with ease, and his daughter Sarah sharpened her tongue into a weapon. The three of them lived in penthouses and wore tailored suits, while I learned how to stretch a dollar at the grocery store. That day in the office, as the lawyer read the will, the gap between us felt wider than ever. The estate was valued at $9 million, split cleanly between Michael and Sarah. They exchanged glances of triumph, the kind of look people give when they believe they have won a race no one else could even enter. My name was mentioned once, attached not to stocks, property, or savings, but to an heirloom coat described as though it were a consolation prize. When the coat was brought forward, wrapped in crisp white tissue paper, I already felt the sting. Michael let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "All those years and this is what you get," he said. His voice carried amusement, but beneath it was cruelty. Sarah leaned in with a smirk, whispering just loud enough, "I guess charity cases don't need trust funds." My Uncle Richard crossed his arms and watched me, silent but satisfied. He didn't need to mock me aloud. His silence was his way of stamping the moment into permanence. I wanted to speak, to tell them that I didn't need their money, that I had something more valuable, that my grandmother's love was worth more than any check, but the words died in my throat. I could feel heat crawling up my neck, humiliation pressing down on my chest until breathing became difficult. So I stood, thanked the lawyer with a voice that trembled despite my best effort, and walked out with the coat held tight against me. The city outside was alive with movement. Yellow cabs honked, steam rose from the subway grates, and people in tailored jackets hurried past with phones pressed to their ears. I felt invisible among them, carrying what everyone in that office had treated as a worthless rag. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, the seams worn thin, and one pocket had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. Yet when I held it close, I remembered winter nights when my grandmother draped it over my shoulders as I sat at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup. It smelled faintly of cedar, the way her house always did. I kept replaying her decision in my mind. Why would she give me nothing more than this coat? She knew the life I had. She knew how hard I worked just to scrape by. She knew how Richard and his children treated me. Was this her final message to me? A reminder that I would never belong in the family's circle of privilege? Or was it her way of saying that love cannot be measured in assets? By the time I reached my apartment, the humiliation had mixed with anger. I threw the coat onto the couch, pacing the floor as Michael's words replayed in my head. All those years, and this is what you get. I wanted to call someone, to shout into the phone, to let out the bitterness rising inside me, but I had no one to call. Friends at the bookstore would not understand. Family outside of my grandmother's circle had drifted years ago. The silence in my apartment was louder than their laughter. I sat down eventually, staring at the coat. The dim light from my lamp highlighted every crease in the fabric, every stitch that had held it together. I thought of her hands folding it neatly, placing it in tissue paper, making sure it would be delivered to me. My chest tightened. Maybe she had wanted me to remember her not with dollar signs but with warmth, the way she had always been to me. Still, the sting of that office was too fresh. I reached for the coat, ready to toss it into the trash. That was when I felt it, something rigid hidden beneath the lining. My fingers traced the seam, and for the first time that day, hope sparked in the darkness. The rigid line beneath the coat's lining stayed in my mind the entire night. I had felt it clearly with my fingertips, but I had been too drained, too ashamed to cut it open right then. I lay awake on the old couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene. The sound of their laughter clung to me like smoke. I imagined them celebrating at some rooftop bar, raising glasses of champagne, clinking their crystal flutes over the millions that had landed in their laps. Meanwhile, I sat alone with a second-hand lamp and peeling paint on my walls, holding a coat that seemed to announce my place in life, forgotten, left behind, insignificant. By morning, humiliation had hardened into anger. I pulled on my jacket, shoved the old coat under my arm, and walked to the corner diner for breakfast. The bell jingled as I entered. I slid into a booth, the coat pressed against my side like an unwanted reminder. The waitress, Linda, set down coffee without asking. She had seen me often enough to know I could not afford more than eggs and toast. She eyed the bundle beside me. "New coat?" she asked. I shook my head. "Old one. My grandmother's." Linda smiled faintly, unaware of the storm churning in me. "Then it's worth more than any new one," she said before moving on to the next table. Her words were meant kindly, but they stung. Worth more. To me, it felt like proof that I had been dismissed. To Michael and Sarah, it was the punchline to a private joke. My uncle's smirk haunted me most of all. He had wanted this ending, had worked toward it, making sure I was always the outsider. Now he had succeeded. The conflict was not only with them, it was within me. A part of me wanted to cling to the coat as a relic of my grandmother's love. Another part wanted to burn it to erase the humiliation it carried. I could not decide which voice was louder. After breakfast, I walked through the city with the coat folded in my arms. The autumn wind bit at my face. I passed storefronts filled with suits I could never afford, couples dining at tables I would never sit at, and cars I could never dream of driving. Each window reflected me back at myself, a man in thrift store clothes carrying a relic from another life. As I reached the subway entrance, I stopped at a trash bin. I stood there staring at it, coat in hand. All I had to do was lift the lid and drop it inside. It would be over. I could return to my bookstore job, bury the memory of the will reading, and let the Carter family live in their world of penthouses and privilege. For a moment, the idea felt freeing. Then my fingers brushed the lining again. That hard line beneath the stitches was unmistakable. It had not been there when my grandmother wore it around the house years ago. She had added something. Why? The thought caught hold of me like a hook. I pulled the coat back against my chest and descended into the subway instead. On the train ride back to Hartford, I kept the coat across my lap. The car was crowded, strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, but all I could think about was that seam. I remembered how my grandmother had folded it so carefully. She had not simply tossed it into a box, she had wrapped it in tissue, ensuring it would be delivered to me intact. My chest tightened with a new possibility. Maybe this was not rejection. Maybe it was something else. But doubt whispered too. What if it was nothing? What if it was only the uneven stitching of an old coat? If I cut it open and found scraps of paper or nothing at all, then the last shred of hope would vanish. I would have to accept what my family believed, that I was worth nothing. By the time I arrived back at my apartment, the debate inside me had reached a fever pitch. I dropped the coat on the couch and paced the floor, my heart hammering. The voices of my cousins would not stop echoing in my ears. Michael's laugh, Sarah's hissed remark, Richard's silent approval. They had humiliated me in front of a lawyer, in front of the city, in front of the memory of my grandmother. I stopped pacing and looked at the coat. It lay there, silent but full of weight. If I ignored it, I would live with the gnawing question forever. If I opened it and found nothing, I would collapse under the truth. The fear of both choices tore at me. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother's kitchen. I was 10 years old again, sitting at the table while she stirred soup. She looked over her shoulder at me with the same eyes that had always carried warmth. "Daniel Carter," she said, "you cannot let them tell you who you are. You must find out for yourself." I woke with tears on my face. The next morning, I made my decision. I set the coat on the table, cleared the space, and pulled a pair of scissors from the drawer. My hands trembled as I slid the blade under the seam. With each careful cut, threads snapped like tiny whispers. The sound filled the room. When the final stitch broke, my fingers slipped inside. The hard ridge was there. I gripped it and pulled. Out came a small envelope, sealed tightly, its edges yellowed with age. I stared at it, my breath shallow, the weight of everything pressing down on me. This was it. Whatever my grandmother had left me was inside. My humiliation, my anger, my doubt, all of it balanced on this one fragile piece of paper. The envelope sat in front of me, its edges frayed and its seal unbroken. I stared at it as though it were alive, waiting to see if I had the courage to face what it carried. My grandmother's handwriting stretched across the front, looping and uneven with age, but unmistakably hers. I had seen that handwriting on recipe cards, birthday notes, and the small reminders she used to stick on the refrigerator. Seeing it again now made my chest ache. I picked it up and held it in my hands. It was light, fragile, and yet it seemed to weigh more than the entire world. I thought about leaving it sealed, hiding it in a drawer where it would never have the chance to confirm my fears or answer my questions. If I never opened it, then at least hope could live. But hope mixed with fear is not peace. It gnaws at you every time you sit still. I thought of Michael's smirk, Sarah's sharp whisper, and Uncle Richard's satisfied silence. They believed I had been cast aside. They believed I was nothing. My jaw tightened. I refused to carry that humiliation for the rest of my life. If my grandmother had left me a message, I needed to know what it was, even if it broke me. I set the envelope down, walked to the sink, and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror looked back at me with hollow eyes. I whispered, "You have nothing left to lose." My voice was unsteady, but it was the only push I needed. Back at the table, I slid a knife gently under the seal. The paper cracked as it tore open, releasing a faint, musty smell of old cedar and ink. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thin, the handwriting shaky, but every stroke was filled with intent. Before I read it, I hesitated again. Memories flooded me. My grandmother laughing in the garden as I chased fireflies, her hand steady on mine as she taught me how to knead dough, her voice telling me stories late into the night when I was too afraid to sleep alone. She had been more of a parent than anyone else ever was. She had been my shelter. Could this letter reveal that she had seen me as less than her other grandchildren all along? The fear nearly made me fold it back and tuck it away. But then I heard her voice, in memory, calm and steady. "Daniel, truth is never your enemy. Lies are." I began to read. The first line was simple. "My dearest Daniel, if you are holding this letter, then you are the one I trusted most." I stopped, stunned. My breath caught in my throat. The words were not rejection. They were trust. I read on. She wrote of the estate the way Richard and his children had always worshipped appearances. She explained that leaving them the fortune was not a reward but a test. She wanted to see what they would do with wealth when it was placed in their hands without effort. She knew greed would consume them, and she wanted me far from that destruction. Then she revealed something that made my heart pound louder than the traffic outside. She had accounts, properties, and investments that no one else in the family knew about. Assets she had kept separate from the estate, secured under my name, with instructions hidden in the letter on how to access them. She had not left me behind. She had left me everything that truly mattered to her legacy. I dropped the letter to the table, overwhelmed. My head spun, my chest ached, and my vision blurred. For so long I had believed I was the forgotten one, the unworthy grandson. But here it was, in her own handwriting, I was the one she trusted most. The coat lay crumpled beside the letter, its seams torn open, the fabric rough under my fingers. It no longer looked worthless. It looked deliberate, chosen as a vessel for the truth. She had hidden her last words where only I would think to look. She knew Richard would never bother with it. She knew Michael and Sarah would sneer and toss it aside. But she knew I would hesitate, hold on, and discover the secret within. I rose from the table and paced the room, the letter clutched in my hand. Questions tumbled through my head. Why me? Why had she chosen me to carry this weight? Did she know how unprepared I felt? How small I often saw myself? Then I remembered the nights when she told me I was stronger than I realized. She had believed in me long before I could believe in myself. Still, fear pressed against my ribs. If the letter was true, then my life had just changed forever. Money on that scale was something I had never touched, never even imagined. Could I handle it? Would I become like them if I allowed wealth to dictate who I was? The thought chilled me. I sat back down, read the letter again, and reached the final lines. Daniel, wealth reveals the truth in people. That is why I give it to you. You cared for me when no one else did. You never saw me as a bank or a burden. You saw me as your grandmother. You have the heart to carry this. Promise me you will not let them break you. Promise me you will remember who you are. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. I whispered into the quiet room. I promise. The decision was made. I would not run from this responsibility. I would not let fear or humiliation drive me. I would follow the instructions, contact the lawyer named in the letter, and step into the life my grandmother had prepared for me in silence. For the first time in years, I felt something close to hope. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it inside the coat's inner pocket where it belonged. The coat was no longer a symbol of rejection. It was a key, a bridge from humiliation to redemption. My grandmother's final gift. The following morning, I woke with the letter still pressed against my chest. My eyes were swollen from the tears that had carried me into sleep, but my body felt steadier than it had in months. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the table with the letter laid out before me, and read it again, word by word, as if I needed to etch every line into my memory. The instructions were clear. My grandmother had placed a separate trust in my name, hidden from the estate, secured with the help of an attorney whose contact information was written neatly at the bottom of the page. My hands shook as I picked up the phone. I dialed the number, half expecting it to be disconnected or answered by someone who would laugh at me for believing in a fantasy, but a calm voice greeted me. "Office of Thomas Miller," the man said. My throat tightened. "This is Daniel Carter," I managed to say. "I believe you may have something left for me by Margaret Carter." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a shift in tone. "Mr. Carter, I've been expecting this call for some time. Why don't you come in today?" The office was in a modest brick building downtown. Nothing like the marble tower where Richard and his children had celebrated their inheritance. Thomas Miller was an older man with kind eyes, the kind that reminded me of teachers who actually cared. He gestured for me to sit, then slid a folder across the desk. "Your grandmother was deliberate," he said. "She wanted to protect you, and she wanted you to carry her legacy, not just her name." I opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were documents, property deeds, account statements, investment portfolios. Numbers swam in front of my eyes. Properties in Cambridge and Somerville, a farmhouse in Vermont, several investment accounts that had grown steadily for decades. The figures totaled more than anything I could process, far beyond the $9 million my cousins had fought over. My breath caught. "This can't be right," I whispered. "It is right," Thomas said gently. "She built this quietly. She told me you were the only one she trusted to see it for what it was, a tool, not a trophy. She believed the others would waste their share, but she believed you would build." Tears blurred my vision. For years I had lived believing I was the forgotten grandson, the charity case mocked and dismissed. Now, staring at those papers, I realized my grandmother had never abandoned me. She had chosen me. I leaned back, unable to speak. The weight of humiliation, anger, and loneliness I had carried since the will reading seemed to peel away, replaced by a trembling sense of vindication. Michael's laughter, Sarah's sneers, Richard's silence, all of it lost its power. They had celebrated scraps while my grandmother had entrusted me with her true legacy. When I left the office, the city looked different. The same honking taxis, the same rushing crowds, the same cold wind between buildings. But my chest no longer felt tight with shame. For the first time in years, I walked with my head high. Later that week, I saw them again. Michael and Sarah invited me to dinner, their invitation dripping with condescension. They chose a high-rise restaurant where the chandeliers glittered and the waiters carried plates like works of art. They wanted to gloat again. I arrived wearing the same coat, now stitched carefully where I had cut it open, the envelope still resting inside the pocket like a heartbeat. Michael leaned back in his chair when he saw me. Still hanging on to that thing? Maybe if you polish it enough, someone will think it's vintage. Sarah laughed. Daniel, you could have joined us in Paris if you'd gotten something real from Grandma. Instead, you're stuck in Hartford with that rag. Their voices no longer pierced me. I smiled, calm and steady. You're right, I said. All I have is this coat. But sometimes the things people overlook are worth more than they realize. They scoffed, rolling their eyes, already dismissing me. That was fine. Let them. They didn't know what I carried in my pocket, and they never would. On the train home, I pulled the letter out and read it again. My grandmother's words steadied me. You have the heart to carry this. The truth was, she had given me more than money. She had given me back my sense of worth. She had reminded me that the world does not decide who you are. The people who love you, who truly see you, are the ones who define your place. Back in my apartment, I hung the coat carefully in the closet. I touched the fabric one last time and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." That night, I lay in bed wide awake, not from fear, but from possibility. My grandmother's trust meant I had the chance to shape a future that did not look like the cold arrogance of Richard or the greedy laughter of Michael and Sarah. I had the chance to build something better, something lasting, something she would be proud of. The humiliation of that will reading had nearly broken me, but it was the beginning of a truth I could never have imagined. In that cracked office, when the lawyer handed me a torn coat while everyone else celebrated millions, I thought I had lost everything. Now I understood I had been given everything that mattered. The power of that realization swept through me like a tide. My grandmother had not left me behind. She had chosen me. And with that choice, she had given me the chance to rise above the people who tried to keep me small. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time, I did not wake to the sound of my alarm, dreading another long day of shelving books while my paycheck slipped through my fingers before the month was over. Instead, I woke with a letter that gave me a new sense of purpose. My grandmother's words echoed in me every morning. She had trusted me. She had seen me not as the forgotten one, not as the burden Richard always called me, but as the only one strong enough to carry her true legacy. At first, I told no one. The weight of what she had left me was too great to reveal. The money, the properties, the accounts. It was overwhelming. But even more overwhelming was the responsibility. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen, the way she taught me that strength was not measured by how much you had, but by how you treated others when you had it. I knew I could not let her down. Richard, Michael, and Sarah continued flaunting their inheritance. They posted pictures online of trips to Paris, parties and penthouses, shopping sprees with designer bags piled high. To them, the estate was proof of their worth, a trophy they could wave in the faces of others. Yet behind their polished smiles, I could already see the cracks. Michael's arrogance grew louder. Sarah's tone became more desperate, as if she feared losing her grip on the lifestyle she had been handed. Months later, I learned that their millions were shrinking fast. Investments were squandered on bad deals. Luxury became a hungry beast that devoured everything they owned. By the end of the year, they were still living in expensive apartments, but whispers of debt followed them. Then one evening, as snow began to fall outside my apartment, I received a call. It was Sarah. Her voice, usually sharp and confident, trembled. "Daniel," she said, "can we talk? Maybe over dinner?" I could hear the strain she tried to hide. For years she had mocked me, laughed at me, treated me as if I were beneath her. Now she reached out, not with laughter, but with desperation. Michael followed days later with a message full of forced friendliness, asking if I wanted to catch up. I knew what they wanted. They had begun to sense the truth. Somehow they knew I was not struggling anymore. I met them once more, this time in the same restaurant where they had mocked me for wearing the coat. Michael's suit looked sharper than ever, but his eyes darted nervously when he spoke. Sarah kept her voice sweet, but her hands twisted the napkin in her lap. They tried to ask careful questions, circling the subject, probing without directly begging. I listened, calm and steady, sipping water as though I had all the time in the world. When the moment came, I leaned forward. "You mocked me when all I had was this coat. You laughed when I walked out of that office, and yet this coat carried something you could never buy, her trust. I don't need to prove that to you, but I will never forget how you treated me when you thought I had nothing. They fell silent, their arrogance deflating like a balloon pricked with a pin. For once they had no words. I left them there, not with anger but with clarity. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer carried their mockery like a wound. My grandmother had healed that the moment she entrusted me with her secret. In the months that followed, I began to put her legacy to use. I restored the farmhouse in Vermont she had left, turning it into a community center for children who had grown up the way I had, lonely, overlooked, uncertain of their worth. I funded scholarships for students who could not afford college but had the determination to push forward. I built something that honored her, something that reflected the heart she had always given me. The coat still hangs in my closet. I do not wear it often, but sometimes on quiet nights I take it out, trace the stitches I cut open, and hold it close. It reminds me of where I began. It reminds me that even when the world laughs, even when family betrays you, love has a way of breaking through. The lesson my grandmother gave me is one I will carry forever. Money reveals who people are. Some will waste it, some will worship it, and a rare few will use it to build. She trusted me to be one of the few. As I sit here telling this story, I think back to that day in the lawyer's office, when humiliation pressed me down, and I believed I was nothing. If I had thrown the coat away, I would never have found the envelope. I would never have heard her last words. I would never have discovered that what seemed worthless was worth more than gold. To anyone listening who feels overlooked or dismissed, remember this. Value is not always visible on the surface. Sometimes it is hidden in the places others mock or ignore. Sometimes the smallest thing can hold the greatest gift. My grandmother's legacy was not only the wealth she hid in that coat. It was the reminder that I was never forgotten, never unworthy, and never powerless. That is the gift I carry now, and it is greater than any fortune.